Good evening. Hello and welcome to the Barraclough Memorial Lecture. I'm here this evening to welcome you on behalf of SMEA and of our co-hosts. We also have Tony Ball here from the South Yorkshire Industrial History Society. Is that right? Excellent. And also on behalf of the Newcomen Society as well, who helped to jointly promote this event. We're really fortunate tonight to have Michelle Rawlins here to speak to us about the feisty sisters from Sheffield. Anyone who has been in Sheffield for some time knows that there are no shortage of people like that. And Michelle is here to add to their ranks, I'm sure. Michelle started off as a history graduate.
Yes.
And then moved into journalism. And at the tender age of 23, decided to make a go of being a freelance journalist. And spent many years writing for a wide variety of publications, and has recently decided to teach journalism at the University of Sheffield. And I'll not take up much of the story of how she got into this project, but I'm sure she will tell you about how the story of the Women of Steel resonated with her, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what she has to say about it. So if you'd all like to join me in welcoming her here.
Thank you for having me. I always love being invited to these events, mainly because as a journalist I love to talk, so I find it very hard to shut up. But secondly, I really love cheerleading our Sheffield Women of Steel. They were forgotten about for a very long time, and it's nice now that with the statue in Barraclough and the book that I wrote about them and the campaign that went on, that we don't forget about these tremendous women, because the sacrifices they did make during World War I and World War II, but my speciality is World War II, was tremendous. It was a remarkable thing that they did. And I think resonates more with us now in the sort of world we're living in right now, going through a pandemic and seeing what's going on in Eastern Europe. We sort of understand more sacrifices that people make and the implications that has. So I'm always very happy to talk about our Women of Steel. If my voice starts to drop, just wave at me that I'm not shouting loud enough at the back, and I will speak up a little bit louder. So I'll try not to shout, but hopefully you can hear me. But if I do start dropping, let me know. So as Mark explained, I did a history degree and graduated a very, very long time ago, and then never used my degree for quite some time because I decided I wanted to be a journalist. And I guess the only way I used my history degree was the fact that I could analyse information and I could look at the way people talk, and then I could produce something from it. So I went on to be a journalist, and I worked for a couple of press agencies for a couple of years, and then I went freelance working for all the national newspapers and women's magazines. But always loved history. I've never sort of been able to pull myself away. And it was after I ghost wrote a book in 2018, it might have been 2017, about another amazing Sheffield woman called Gloria Stewart, who hosts a Christmas lunch every year for the lonely of Sheffield, that I was looking for another project. And I'd followed the Women of Steel campaign for quite some time, and watched the campaign unfold and the monument being unveiled in 2016. And I was just Googling to see if there was a book about these women, mainly because I wanted to read it. And also my mother-in-law is a massive, or was a massive, local history fan. She's no longer with us. And I just thought, oh, it'd be really nice for us both to read. And there just wasn't a book. There was lots of local pamphlets about the Women of Steel that the Sheffield Star had produced, which was sort of magazine type thickness, but they sort of, it was a small overview of what these women did. So I spoke to my literary agent and said, you know, do you think there's anything in this? And he's from Yorkshire, so he was very keen and positive and said, right, yes, go and do the research and come back to me with it. So I probably spent about 9 months originally doing some research, which involved speaking to a few of the women of Steel, some of their relatives, and just gathering information. And 9 months sounds like a long time, but I was working full time as well, so I was trying to do this of an evening. And then I wrote my book proposal, and thankfully a publisher bought it. And then I spent another year doing even more research. So I started off with this lady here, who, I'm going to try and get this right. It's not clicking. It's not. Let me just use the arrows. The clicker's not working. It's fine, don't worry, I can use the arrows. This lady here, Kathleen Roberts, and anyone that followed the campaign has maybe heard of Kathleen. She was the lady who started the campaign off. And basically what happened back in 2009, she rang the Sheffield Star and said, I'm really glad the Land Girls get all the publicity and they deserve it, but what about us? And she sort of had a little rant on the phone to the deputy editor of the Sheffield Star about. I can. Thank you. So Kathleen rang the Sheffield Star, and she was just so fed up of not being any of the women of Steel ever being thanked for the work that they'd done. And she'd moaned to her daughters, Julie and Linda, about this. And they said in the end, Mum, if it's annoying you that much, you need to do something about it. When she put the phone down to the deputy editor of the Sheffield Star, she burst into tears because she thought she'd made a fool of herself and that they'd think it was a utter nonsense. And why on earth was she going on about what these female factory workers did? As it happens, they sent out Nancy Fielder, who is now the editor of the Sheffield Star, but was just a reporter at the time, to interview Kathleen, and that's where the campaign began. A few days later, it was their front page story, and they asked for women of Steel from across the city to come forward to tell their story, or relatives to come forward, so they could build up a bigger knowledge of what these women did. And their phones just didn't stop for days. They said every phone call in was about the women of Steel or a relative explaining, yes, I did this, I worked in the factories for 12 hours a day, you know, I had to leave my children with grandparents or neighbours. So they realised then that this generation of women had sacrificed so much but never been thanked for the work they'd done. And that's when the campaign started. So the Sheffield Star decided, well, we've got to do something to recognise these women. And the local MP at the time decided that he would help get these women to London and to meet the Prime Minister so that they could be officially thanked. And these were our leading ladies. And what they had to do was decide which of these women would go to London to meet Gordon Brown. And Nancy had the role of trying to work out which 4 women it would be. And she was very honest. She said these women were getting on a little bit. They were quite elderly. So she went on who was the most mobile and picked 4. Because she knew she had to get them from Sheffield to King's Cross and across London. So she said, I couldn't help 4 women who needed wheelchairs. So I went with the most mobile, and they were Kathleen Roberts, Dorothy Slingsby, Ruby Gascoigne, and Kit Sollitt, who were the 4 ladies there. And they, the railway company put on this really lovely train for them with a great big banner and took them all down to London. The 4 women absolutely loved it. They felt they were being treated like royalty. And Kathleen said, gosh, I just wanted a little thank you in the Sheffield Star. I didn't envisage I'd be meeting Gordon Brown and the Veterans Minister at the time, who did officially thank them. And they had a lovely day where they were thanked officially. They, it was marked down that, you know, they made a tremendous effort towards the war. And Kevin James, who was the then Veterans Minister, actually said, I don't know whether the war would have ended in the same way if it wasn't for these women, because they supplied munitions, they made parts for Spitfires and tanks and other planes and engines. So if they hadn't been doing that job, we might not have ended in the same way as we did. So they got their big thank you, and the women were delighted. At that point, the Sheffield Star and Julie Dorr, who was head of the council, said we need some sort of permanent reminder to commemorate these women in the city. And this was where the campaign began, to have the statue at Barker's Pool commissioned. And this is Ruby Gascoigne, who's no longer with us, with her sons after it was unveiled. And what they decided to do was just start fundraising. But one of the key points was that the city would pay for the statue as opposed to a business. So they did have steelwork companies offering to pay for it, but they said no, because they didn't want a plaque below it saying sponsored by. They wanted it to be a thank you from the city to these women. So nobody was allowed to donate more than £1,000. So it was never going to be a sponsored statue. So instead, the city started fundraising, and they did everything from bringing back the Hillsborough Mile, where people would just walk or run a mile round Hillsborough Park. People had raffles and tombolas, and other people ran the London Marathon. There was lots of events, but as you can imagine, that takes an awfully long time to make the amount of money you need for a statue to be commissioned. They knew they needed about £150,000, and it was going to take more than, 100 or so people running marathons and doing tombolas. And this is where they decided. Julie Dore got in touch with John Palmer, who used to work at Hallam University, and he knew a lot of people in the music industry from Sheffield, and he'd done a lot of fundraising events, and he helped massively with the campaign. And that's when they decided to put on this music concert at the City Hall, which obviously was quite symbolic, because the City Hall was where these ladies would go dancing during the war on a Saturday night as a way to stress relief and forget about what was going on around them. So the City Hall obviously offered the venue free of charge, and all the acts that night performed free of charge. So it was a huge, huge event. And this is where most of the money came from, to be able to commission the statue. As well as that, they also had a folk concert. Again, a huge following of folk in the city, and that raised an awful lot of money as well. And so much so they had too much money, and they knew they had more than enough for the statue. And it was John Palmer's wife who said, well, why don't we, with the extra money, create medallions for every woman of steel or a family member, and it can be a keepsake for them. So whenever I went to interview these women, these medallions were on their mantelpieces or in their sort of dressers, pride of place, as a thank you for these women. So they raised the money, and then they had to commission a sculptor, and they chose a man called Martin Jennings, who is quite a famous sculptor. And when I interviewed him, he said it was such an honour to do this, because he always creates sculptures of men, and it's never women, and it's such a rarity that we have a statue of women. He was under a lot of pressure. Our 4 leading ladies were welcomed down to his workshop in Oxford to watch him produce this and create this statue, and were very forthright and said things like, if you don't hurry up, we'll be dead, we're never going to see this statue, because you can't create a statue overnight, it takes time. And they were also very fussy about what the statue looked like. So when they produced the maquette, which is in the Millennium Galleries, they said to Martin, don't forget, we had hips and busts and a bum, so don't make us look like we're men in these dungarees. So if anyone who's seen the statue at Barker's Pool, you'll see that the dungarees are nipped in at the waist, and the women do have breasts and a bottom. And it was very important for these women, because when they started working in the factories, their femininity was taken away from them, because these were great, dirty, noisy factories, and they were given boiler suits or dungarees to wear, and they hated them. They wanted to look pretty and feminine, so they would all go home and nip and tuck these uniforms so that they could be pulled in at the waist and enhance their figures. So it was very important that when the statue was created, that it was symbolic of actually what these women looked like and what they represented. So when I was chatting to Martin for the book, he said, I've never had pressure like it from 4 women in their 80s who were telling me, yeah, they must have busts and they must have a waist. But, you know, the women loved it. And actually the 4 leading women of the campaign were still around in 2016 when the statue was unveiled, and they were delighted, and it was a huge event for them. There was quite a concert atmosphere in Barker's Pool, and there was dancing in the street, and you know, the women were just delighted. They finally felt that they would never now be forgotten. Kathleen Roberts had achieved her dream of making sure that these women would always be remembered for the sacrifices they made, and which was lovely. You know, they got what they wanted, and when I spoke to their relatives, they said it kept them alive for those 6 or 7 years when they were campaigning. You know, these were elderly people, and they said it gave them something to live for. And also what I discovered when I was interviewing the women who were still alive is they hadn't spoken about their contribution for the war effort for years, if at all. When I interviewed a lot of the ladies and the women, their relatives were saying, I'd never heard this story, mum's never told me, or my nan's never told me. And I encouraged the relatives to record the interviews as I was doing them, because you know, these women weren't getting any younger, and it was such an important part of social history that you record it. So they did, and I heard some incredible stories that I don't think I'll ever forget, and I'm just going to share a few of them with you so you sort of understand the sacrifices these women made and who these women were. So Ruby Gascoigne is the lady you've just seen in the last slide at these statue with her sons. When she joined the war effort, she was only 17, and as you can see from this picture, she was a very innocent, young-looking girl. You know, and a lot of them were. There was a real mix in the factories of very young girls who had maybe worked in sweet shops or been in service or been elderly people's companions. Then you had buffer girls as well and other factory workers. So there was a real cross-section of where these women came from, and Ruby was definitely one of the sheltered girls, and her story for ending up in the factory was quite unique. So on the first night of the Sheffield Blitz in December 1940, Ruby was working at Green's sweet shop opposite the Gaumont in the city centre, and her job was to serve the cinema goers their sweets before they went in the cinema, and then she was allowed to go home. On this particular Thursday night, intelligence had come in that Sheffield was going to get hit, that the Luftwaffe were targeting Sheffield that night. So Ruby's boss, Mr. Green, had said to her, don't work till 8 o'clock, go home at 7 o'clock, just shut up shop, put the money in the biscuit tin under the floorboards, which is where it was kept, and go home. But at 6 o'clock, Ruby, a mouse ran across the sweet shop floor, and Ruby hit the ceiling, as according to her history of this, and refused to stay a moment longer. She was terrified of mice, so she put all the takings in the biscuit tin under the floorboards and went home. At 7 o'clock, the shop took a direct hit and was completely obliterated and was just rubble. So if she'd have stayed till 7 o'clock, the chances are she possibly would have died, well, highly likely. And she told everyone for the rest of her life that a mouse saved her life the night of the Sheffield Blitz, which in many ways did. And the next morning, Mr. Green went down to the sweet shop and found his takings, but not much else. So he did have his takings. But of course, what that meant was Ruby didn't have a job. So on the Monday, she was aiming to go to the Labour Exchange and sign on, and they would have sent her straight to a factory. What actually happened was on the Sunday night was the second night of the Sheffield Blitz. And Ruby's dad, Ben, was a coal miner, and he was working at Tinsley Pit, and he didn't come home. And what happened happened is if you were a miner during the war and the air raid started, you pulled a double shift underground. It was deemed you were safer there than to try and come back up, and the shifts changed over. So the air raids came on again, and it was one of the longest air raids outside London. It went on for a prolonged period of time. By the time Ben came home the following morning, he'd walked through Darnell and said, we've got to go and check on his wife's sister because Coleridge Street has taken a hit, and his sister-in-law lived on that road. So they were very worried that well, Ruby's auntie might have died and her relatives. So they all got up, the mum and daughter got their coats on, and they went to Coleridge Road. And as they walked down the road, it was just obliterated. Houses were destroyed, windows were smashed, there was belongings all across the street. As they got further down the road, it was better. So it was the first end of the road that had taken the direct hit. And Ben kept saying, where are all the air raid wardens? There's just no one here apart from people obviously very confused and in chaos because their homes have been destroyed. And he finally saw quite a young air raid warden and said, you know, where's all your colleagues? And he said, oh, the air raid warden's office took a direct hit and they were all killed outright. And at that point, Ruby collapsed because her partner, Frank's mum and dad were the air raid wardens. So her life had been saved on the Thursday night by a mouse, but 3 nights later, her sweetheart's parents were killed outright. So it was just this awful, bittersweet story where her life had been saved and she knew before her partner that his mum and dad were dead. And it was just, you know, when you think about that, you think about that human travesty, and obviously we're seeing it happen in Ukraine at the moment. This was somebody's life and somebody's family that was destroyed. Frank was obviously sent home from war. He had a younger brother and sister who were obviously now orphaned. And he had, and don't forget, this was literally 12 days before Christmas as well. It was a horrific time of year. Not that there's ever a good time for your home to be destroyed and your parents killed. His dad was a member of a society that's a little bit like the Masons, and it was based in Harrogate. And they took his younger brother in and they schooled him and homed until he was 18. And his sister ran away because she wanted to join the auxiliary service. So she ran off the hill. The reason I'm smiling about this story is the one funny thing that Ruby told everybody is at Christmas, Frank asked her to marry him. And she admitted this till the day she died, is that, oh, I never thought I'd marry him. I liked him, but I sort of said yes because I felt he needed something to smile about. The only reason she married him. And by the time war was finished, they had 2 sons. So every time Frank came home on leave, she fell pregnant. He met his first son before the end of the war, but his second son, he didn't meet until war was over. And he just always referred to his daddy as the photograph on the mantelpiece, which was a very typical story of small children during the war, because this is what happened. Husbands would come home, wives get pregnant, and then they don't see them for a couple of years. So I always tell this story because I just think it shows, you know, the complete devastation of what the war did. But also, you know, in a very positive sense, Ruby and Frank did go on to have a very long marriage. The one interesting thing that came out of it as well was when the war ended and Frank came home, their son Kevin explained to me in great detail that his mum and dad had to fall back in love again because they were very different people to when the war started. Ruby had started off as this very sweet 17-year-old girl who didn't say boo to a goose. She was very shy. She'd been wrapped in cotton wool. She was an only child. And, you know, by the time war was finished, she had 2 children. So she was a very different type of woman. And the one way I remember Kevin telling me is on their, this is obviously their wedding picture, on their wedding night, obviously Ruby and Frank spent the night together, and the following morning she ran home to her mum and said, "You never told me that would happen," and she was absolutely horrified. So she was a very sweet girl at the start, very innocent young girl at the start of war, but by the time war was over, she was, you know, she had 2 children, she was still working in a steel factory, and she was quite matriarchal. She could easily talk to men, and Frank was a little bit jealous, and they had to fall back in love again. And I think war did that to a lot of couples. The next lady I like to talk about is Dorothy, who again was one of our lead women of steel. And if you can see by this photo, now that I'm not stood in front of the screen, she was quite a waif-like, elfin type of girl. She was very slender, very tiny, but her personality far outweighed what her physical stature represented. And Dorothy had passed away by the time I started my research, and I spoke to one of her daughters and her son in great detail. And what they always said is Mum was just formidable, in the sense she almost had to make up for how slight and petite she was, and she did that with her personality. So when war broke out, she went along to the labour exchange, and they sent her off to a factory, and she wanted to be a crane driver. And the foreman in the factory took one look at her and went, "There's no way you can be a crane driver. You're far too little and petite." And they were stood in front of one of these, you know, 30-foot ladders for a crane. And by the time he'd finished his sentence, she was halfway up the ladder and said, "Yes, I can." And she did go on to be a crane driver. And in fact, one of the best crane drivers this factory had ever had. A foreman was always complimenting her. What also happened to Dorothy was it was a very male-heavy industry, as you can imagine, is that the men who were still at home, who hadn't gone off to war because they were reserved jobs, but some did decide to go anyway, is they weren't used to women working in the factory. They weren't used to socializing with women in a work environment. And the female any new crane driver was teamed up with a more experienced crane driver for a couple of weeks till they learnt what to do. And Dorothy's partner was very touchy-feely, and he had lots of wandering hands. And Dorothy put up with it for a couple of weeks until she'd had enough, and said to this cabbie, "If you lay your hand on me once more, I'm going to throw you over the side of this cab." But apparently she said it with such ferocity that it literally did take him aback. He didn't expect this timid, elfin young girl to sort of, you know, question his actions. I mean, absolutely, she had every right to, and well done her. When she came down from the cab, the foreman looked at her and said, "You don't look yourself, Dorothy, is something wrong?" And she told him, and she was furious. She said, "I'm not having this," you know. So the foreman removed him to a part of the factory where no women worked, and said he would never work in the factory where there was women ever again. And what I discovered when I was doing my research is that the foremen were very much like this. They were very fatherly or uncly or grandfather type people who, you know, they were old enough to be these women's dads, uncles or granddads, and they really protected them. And, you know, they said, "Well, no, you can't do that. It's wrong." And bearing in mind, this was the 1940s. There was no big feminist movement at that point. You know, people were just surviving the war. But the foremen were very, very protective of these young girls, and probably sort of made their lives a lot easier. And I always think, when I've written my fictional books, I've got a lovely foreman in my fictional book who looks after all our steel girls, because that it's true to life. That's what happened. And my next lady, Ivy, was sort of the opposite of quite a lot of the women I interviewed. So a lot of the women I interviewed were very nervous about going into the factories. They described them as hell on earth. There was a cacophony of noise. They were nervous. They were frightened. It was dangerous. Whereas Ivy was the complete opposite. She'd worked at Bachelor's in Hillsborough and just wasn't afraid of anything. And she left Bachelor's because because they asked her to work and the night shifts, but wouldn't pay her any extra money. So she said, well, I'm not doing that, and walked out. Because you knew then you could walk into another job. So she went to work at a factory and loved every minute of it. She loved the fact that she earned more money. She loved the camaraderie of all the women. They would sing all day, which added to them being called the Canary Girls, because the men said they just didn't stop chirping all day. And the other thing was her partner, Lewis, was in a reserve service, in a reserve job, so he didn't go off to war, so she wasn't worrying about her loved one. She didn't have a brother or a dad at war, so her life was quite nicely contained in Sheffield. She didn't get married till after the war, and she was really happy, and she loved the fact that she earned more money so she could buy more clothes and go out dancing on a Saturday night. But I think it's really important that we tell the positive stories, because so many of these women did find the factories quite daunting and terrifying, but what they all said to me was the camaraderie between the women was what kept them going. And Kathleen, who I mentioned right at the beginning, told me a lovely story about she came from quite a well-to-do family, and she'd been a bridesmaid for her cousin, and the dress she wore, her bridesmaid dress, she shared with the women she worked with, and she said 10 women got married in that dress because they had no money and she had a dress and she shared it. And I just thought, you know, that really helped keep up morale when times are really tough. And she talked to me about chopping her lipstick in half and wrapping it in greaseproof paper and giving it to somebody else, one of the other women in the factory that couldn't afford much. And it was really important that they had that, because it was a hard slog for them. They were worried about loved ones at war. They were working in very, very dangerous conditions where there was no health and safety. The only health and safety was wear a mop cap so your hair doesn't get ripped out, or wear long sleeves so you don't get burnt. So to actually have that female friendship in a very alien industry to them was really important. And Ivy sort of personified it, because she loved every single minute of it, and she was very angry when war finished that she got a note in her final pay slip saying you're not needed on Monday, the men are back. And that's how most of their jobs ended. They just got a little note in their payslip, and she was furious about it. And even when I interviewed her in her 90s, she was still very angry about it and reminded me that it was wrong, which it was, obviously. And then Dot, I love to tell Dot's story, mainly because she was 105 when I interviewed her. And I was just in awe of what she could remember. So I can barely remember what I did this morning, let alone what I did years ago. And I went to see Dot. She was living in a care home for the partially sighted and blind when I interviewed her. And we sat down for hours and we had this lovely chat about what she remembered from the war. And the two things I wanted to tell you about today was when war broke out, she was a nanny and she was working in service in Purley in Surrey. And as soon as war broke out, she handed her notice in and said, I've got to go back to Sheffield because that's where I belong and I've got to do my bit. And her employers begged her not to go. They said they lived out in the country and they said, look, you'll be much safer here and we can't do without you. They treated her like their own daughter, but she was absolutely adamant she had to come back to Sheffield. So she did come back to Sheffield, and her job was stamping on the steel, so putting the trademark on and dating the steel. It did obviously leave her partially sighted because, again, she was sort of bending over steel and stamping it all day, and did leave her short-sighted for the rest of her life. The other story about Dot is on the first night of the Sheffield Blitz. She's here with her sister, older sister, Elizabeth. They'd gone to see the Henry Hall Band on the Thursday night at the Empire on the Moor. And they were very excited. They were having a night out. Elizabeth had a daughter called Pat, who was 5 at the time. So it was a real treat for them to go out. Just as the concert started, the manager came onto the stage and said, the air raids have begun. You need to go to safety or you need to go underground here. And the Henry Hall Band said they were going to play throughout the actual air raid and that they wouldn't be moved. As it happened, the Empire didn't get damaged, which was one of the only buildings on the moor that didn't. They've got some shrapnel, they had some shrapnel damage to the corner of the building. But Dot, in her naivety and innocence, said to her sister, come on, we've got to go outside. This is going to be like watching a movie. It'd be like fireworks, not realising what an air raid was, because Sheffield had had some minor air raids in the August, but they hadn't suffered a blitz by that point. So they went outside, and obviously wasn't what they expected. The moor was a corridor of flames. All the shops were literally on fire. Buildings were blown out. And obviously it was terrifying. Very quickly, an air raid warden rushed Dot and her sister into the vaults of the Yorkshire Bank, which was on the corner of Surrey Street, and that's where they remained all night. And they said it was utterly terrifying because they could hear the bombs dropping and the bangs, and obviously there was soot coming through into the vaults, so they were black by the time they left. And they didn't know what was going on outside. They didn't know what they were going to go out to after the raid stopped. When they finally did go out, it was the early hours of the morning, and obviously Pat's dad, Elizabeth's husband, was at home, and where he lived in Sheffield, he could sort of see down into the city. The city centre was on fire, and didn't know whether his wife and his sister-in-law were alive or not. So obviously when they did get home, there was lots of tears and emotion, and 5-year-old little Pat was hugging her mummy. They'd spent the night in between the coal shed and underneath the stairs because they were too scared to go into the air raid shelter, and they were waiting obviously for Pat and Elizabeth to come home. And what was also interesting about that story is they got home at 7 in the morning after not having any sleep. And I heard this story so many times from our Women of Steel. Dot got changed and walked back into the city centre to do a full day's work because she didn't want to let her colleagues down, and knew how important it was that the factories carried on making munitions and parts. After that, she did end up spending 2 weeks in bed because she was obviously very poorly after that, and the shock of it finally hit her. But I heard so many women say that to me. They were up all night, they got home and they walked back to work. And I just think the work ethic and the determination to do that bit during the war just shone through all the way through. And this lady is another example of this. Florence, again, the first night of the Sheffield Blitz, lived on a street where half the street got obliterated. So her house ended up looking like a doll's house. It was still intact, but the side wall had gone, and the neighbours' houses were decimated. So she said it was like looking in and I could take things out. But all her neighbours' houses had been destroyed. They'd spent the night in the communal air raid shelter. The men had come out of the air raid shelter and they were using dustpan lids to put out incendiary fires. And then when they came out in the morning, Florence's mum, who's also called Florence, was just devastated for her friends and her neighbours, and said, I just need to do something. You know, these people are homeless. They've got literally what they can scrape out of their buildings. So she walked round to the butcher's round the corner and said, your customers are homeless, what can you do? And he gave her a big piece of bone marrow, and he told her to go and put it in a big pan of vegetables with some brawn and gravy browning and gravy salt, and that the flavours would seep through. So that's what she did. She made this great big pan of food for her neighbours, because she said that's all I could do. There was nothing else I could do, but at least I could give them a hot meal. And I tell that story just because I think it really, again, it shows what neighbours did to help each other during the war. And I think we sort of saw that come back a little bit during the pandemic, where we had lots of WhatsApp chats going on and neighbours offering to do shopping for people who were isolating. And I remember phoning up a few of my Women of Steel and asking them how they felt. And they said, well, first of all, they were we've only had this for 6 weeks, we lived like this for 6 years. So they were very dismissive at first and said, I've seen worse than this. But actually what they did say is that neighbourly spirit, which had sort of disappeared, you know, because we all live very busy lives, we all work full time, you know, that neighbourly spirit had started to disappear over the decades and actually came back again. And they said that was really wonderful to see. And of course now we're seeing it again with what's happening in Ukraine and this sort of global effort to help refugees. And Gwen's got a tremendous story, and quite recently, actually, which was really lovely, a reader got in touch with me and said, gosh, my Nanan used to work with Gwen, can you put me in touch with her? And I love getting those emails, because I just think, wow, you know, that's really touched someone. And she was telling me stories about her own Nanan and how she remembered Gwen and the stories she'd grown up with. But Gwen is still with us. She's 100 this year. And she told me this, and I think this will resonate so much with what's going on with Russian pilots and soldiers right now, is the morning after the second night of the Blitz, Gwen walked to work on the Monday morning, and a German fighter plane had crashed into the window of CNA. Obviously, the pilot was dead, and obviously a lot of damage. And passerbys were swearing at him and spitting at him and throwing stones at the plane, because they were just frustrated. Their city had just been obliterated over 2 nights, and he was the vent of their frustration. Now, Gwen was only 19 at the time. She was a really young girl. She came from quite a tough background, so she wasn't naive like Ruby. She was quite a tough old boo, and she stood there and shouted at all these people, please stop, he's someone else's son. And I remember when I interviewed her being just so blown over by that, because she was 19. There's a huge crowd of people spitting and swearing at this fighter pilot, who obviously, you know, the Germans had caused a lot of deaths, but he was just a pilot doing his job. And what made this story more astonishing is this very same weekend, her brother, Henry, had gone missing in action in the Far East. And just before Christmas, which was obviously only 2 weeks later, they got a telegram to say he was dead. He'd been killed in action. And when I interviewed Gwen, I said to her, did you ever regret sticking up for the pilot? And she said, no, of course I didn't, because like my mum, his mum was grieving somewhere in the world. That mum had lost her son, and she was suffering like my mum was. And I just remember thinking, what a tremendous attitude for such a young woman, you know, and nobody would have been angry with her or upset with her for her being angry and resentful. But in actual fact, she was very forgiving and just said he was doing his job and he was fighting someone else's war. These young lads didn't have any choice. And, you know, more than ever right now, I should imagine that resonates with most of us when we hear about what Russian soldiers and conscripts are going through, and we hear footage of them having no idea they were going in to fight a war. So I always like to tell Gwen's story, because I just think it reminds us of kindness and humanity, and that, you know, that empathy and understanding that this soldier or this pilot was just doing his job. It wasn't his decision to go and fly over Sheffield and drop bombs. It was somebody else's. And then the very last story I like to tell, and I always wonder whether I should change my slides around because it's such a sad, sad story. But when I was writing Women of Steel, one of the things all the relatives asked me to do was not rose tint the book and not look at it as a bygone age, that, you know, we talk about the morale and how lovely it was, but they wanted the real stories of the war to come through. And John Proctor's story was sadly one of these very, very heart-rending stories where he was a prisoner of war. He'd gone off to war at 18 and within 3 months was captured and literally spent 6 years as a prisoner in captivity. And he saw the worst of what the war entailed. He was beaten brutally. He went into Dresden when they dropped the bomb in Dresden. He was part of the cleanup operation, and he was faced with women holding babies who'd been frozen like statues, because when the bomb dropped, it sucked all the oxygen out of the air and people just froze how they were and died. He saw his friend shot in the head. So when he was in one of the prisoner of war camps, when you needed to go to the toilet, you had to walk up to a trench with your hands in the surrender position, wait for a sentry guard to nod, and then you were allowed to use the toilet. And John and his friend had done this. They'd followed all the rules, walked to the trench, been given the nod, and as they went to urinate, the soldier shot his friend in the head, just because, for no other reason than it was pure evil. So John was a very damaged man when war ended. And when he'd written to Joan, Joan was his pen pal. She'd been introduced to him through one of her friends who was one of John's friends, and they became pen pals. She never really understood what a prisoner of war was, because again, these girls were very young and innocent. And when she got home, the giveaway is where Joan is holding her bouquet. They got married 3 months after war ended. She got pregnant very, very quickly. And she felt, you know, she didn't know him. She knew him from the letters that he wrote to her, but he never disclosed to her in those letters what he'd been through. Very quickly, their relationship deteriorated, and John was understandably very, very psychologically damaged. He had an awful temper, he would drink, he would lash out, he had psychotic episodes. And the way to treat anyone with post-traumatic stress disorder then was to send them to Middlewood Hospital for electric shock therapy, which obviously did absolutely no good whatsoever. With John's was so severe, they gave Joan the consent forms for him to have a lobotomy, and John begged his wife not to sign the consent forms, and obviously very, very distraught, and she didn't. But it was only because she didn't sign those consent forms that they didn't perform the operation. Treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder didn't enter the UK till the 70s. They started having treatment in the 60s in America. So John struggled throughout his married life. And Mandy, his daughter, said, you know, he was an amazing granddad, but as a dad and a husband, he had periods of dark depression that generally lasted from December to February every year, because this was the anniversary of when terrible things had happened to him, or he'd witnessed terrible things. And then he'd have periods of being happy, but it was very up and down. By the time John got his treatment, Joan had got dementia, and I found this so heartbreaking that by the time he said sorry to her, she didn't know. She didn't know he was saying sorry, because she had dementia and she didn't understand what had happened, what he was saying sorry for. And Mandy said it just broke her heart. And Mandy didn't understand what had happened to her dad until after he died. And at his funeral, she spoke to some of his old school friends and said, you know, was my dad always like this? And they said, no, he went off to war with a skip in his step. He was a really happy-go-lucky, cheerful young man. The only reason he'd gone to war is he had a very bad relationship with his mum. So he'd actually gone to war to escape his home life. And then you just think, gosh, this poor boy, he was 18, he'd gone to war to escape his home life, then was captured. And then the rest of his life, he battled either psychologically with what he'd seen, or with guilt, because by the time he realised that he hadn't been the best husband or the best dad, his wife had dementia. And I always, when I was writing their story up, and when I was interviewing Mandy, you know, I said to her, are you sure you want me to use this? Because once it's in the book, I can't take it away. And she said, no, it has to be in there, because people have to understand that when the war ended, these women, their lives, they stopped working in the factories, but their lives actually in many ways became much harder, because most women who were married to soldiers or artillerymen or pilots, they came back very, very damaged, physically and psychologically. And Kathleen Roberts, who I mentioned right at the start, her husband came back very, very poorly, and woke up with night sweats for years and years. He begged his wife never to tell their daughters why, and he wouldn't celebrate VE Day. He refused to celebrate it, because he said, how can I celebrate when I've seen my friends being killed? He said, this isn't a celebration, this is just a relief, it's over. So I was very conscious that one of the last chapters in the book is what happened to the women after the war ended, and this sort of life that they were left with wasn't suddenly happy again. But I got lots of emails, and especially from the relatives of the women I'd interviewed, or the relatives I've interviewed, and they all said, thank you for not rose tinting it and actually portraying what happened realistically, because it's always very easy, isn't it, to look back on that sort of bygone age and say, oh, we shared cups of sugar with our neighbour and we went to dances, but actually they're just the nice shiny bits. The other stuff is what absolutely ruled their lives, and you know, going to a dance gave them a bit of escapism, but the reality of their lives was very hard. So that's why when I started going full circle, started the research for my book, well, for all my books, which I'll talk about in a second, is that I just feel very privileged that I could be a part of documenting these women's history, and also allowing that their stories will now never be forgotten, that their voices are heard, and that they're there in the, you know, the history books for forever for anyone who wants to read them. And the last thing I just wanted to say is, after I finished writing Women of Steel, another publisher got in touch with me and said to me, would you consider writing a trilogy of fictional books on your Women of Steel? And I really had to think about it. I mean, most people, they were offering me a triple book deal. Most people would jump and go, yes, definitely. But it was something I had to take a lot of time to think about, only because writing Women of Steel was a factual book, and believe it or not, journalists generally deal in fact. You know, everyone will go, oh, do they? They do. And I found writing their stories quite not an easy process, in the fact what I heard and I had to write, but it was very natural to me to write their stories down and record them. But to actually turn their stories into fiction, I had to think about. And I said I would only do it if the stories I wrote in my fictional books were based on facts. So all my characters in the Steel Girls are based on the women I interviewed. So I've got the equivalent to Dorothy Slingsby, the crane driver, who does have an incident where a man pushes her up and she threatens him. You know, I've got all these women I interviewed are in the Steel Girls, but with a little bit of poetic license. So I always say I couldn't have written my fictional novels without doing my research, because every one of their stories is based on fact, and I actually couldn't have I don't have the imagination to make those stories up. So I did say yes, and the third book is out this summer, and the first two are obviously now on sale, and it has been a real privilege, because I just feel it's another way of me contributing to making sure that our Sheffield Women of Steel are never forgotten, hopefully. And that's it. Thank you. So I probably, it's gone on and on. I'm still interviewing people now, but I think when I wrote Women of Steel, between 20 and 30, so probably 20 women who were still alive, and then their relatives plus relatives of people that weren't alive. And that was just the women. I also interviewed people like Julie Dorr and John Palmer and Martin Jennings, who was a school. So lots and lots. No, they were sent by the Labour Exchange, and they were literally given a little blue ticket, and it would say the name of the factory and the time and the gate they had to arrive at, and that's all they had. And I remember Kathleen saying, he literally, when they opened the doors to one of the big shops, she said it was like looking at hell on earth. She said, and the noise, she said she never heard noise like it. And another lady, Alma Taylor, said she became a crane driver, and so when she was up in the cab, the steel girders, said there was a foot of dust just on the steel girder. These women didn't wear masks. They breathed this in for 8, 12 hours a day, and most of them ended up with lung problems, obviously. No, we're definitely not unique. I mean, I know lots of authors and journalists, so most of my author friends started off as journalists as well, who have written about similar industries around the country. So in Sunderland, the shipyard workers, that was a huge female industry during the war. Obviously in the East End, they had women working in factories. It's there. Derby had a big munitions plant, as I think Coventry did. So no, we're not unique. It's just not all of them have been written about. And in fact, I did somebody contacted me after Women of Steel came out and asked me if I would write about the women in Derby who did a similar thing, but I need to be in the city where I'm doing the research, because otherwise I'd be back and forth, and I'd love to do more, but I need a publisher to give me the time to do it as well. So no, not unique at all. No. And Barrow-in-Furness as well, another big shipyard industry. There's lots of women who work in the factories there too. No, some of them did stay. It was only a small percentage. I interviewed one lady whose nana worked in the factory till she was 60. So yeah, some of them did stay, but the majority were let go because the men needed their jobs back. Yes. Yeah, in fact, to varying degrees. So Kathleen, who I told you about, lifting up a shell, there was a group of women that were asked to lift a shell, and for anyone who's not seen a shell, there's one at Callum Island Museum. They are ginormous. I'm just trying to sort of compare it to this pillar. They're huge, big, heavy things, and she was lifting it with a group of women, and her back went. So they were actually, the men in the factory were very kind to her, and what they did is they put her in a lister truck. And for anyone who doesn't know what a lister truck is, it's like a wooden cart, is the best way to describe it. And they packed it with their coat, but then rolled her over the cobbles and did her more damage. And she's 100 now, Kathleen, and to this day her back still struggles. Dot ended up with poor eyesight. Another lady I interviewed, also called Alma, worked in one of the tank factories where they made the caterpillar trails for the tanks. And what would happen is the granules, she said it was like razor sharp black sand. It was the only way she could describe it. Came down a funnel and into this mould in front of her, but the vibrations literally virtually gave her a nervous breakdown, and in the end the doctor said she had to stop working because the noise from the vibrations literally nearly killed her. So, and then the one of the, I wrote about a man who was decapitated because they still wore neck scarves to work, and you just wouldn't be allowed to do that now, and his neck got caught in a pull and it decapitated him. Another lady didn't have a mop cap on, and the lathe pulled all her hair out. So yeah, very, very dangerous conditions. They had no health and safety. So not a good place to work. So it makes you think when you hear about those stories about women who gave up their jobs in service and then they went to work in those factories, it was a massive sacrifice they were making. Admittedly, they didn't know what they were entering, but they didn't leave either. It was that Alma was the only lady I heard of that left partway through the war, and that was because the doctor told her she couldn't carry on. Yeah. I'd like to. It just depends heavily on the publisher giving me the time to do it. Because I did all this while I was working full time, so a lot of my research worked around my full-time job. But with the Steel Girls, I'm still researching all the time to make those stories as authentic and true to life as possible. So it depends what you mean by research. I will sit on Google and YouTube, and I will ring people continually to sort of spend any more time on that. I need someone to say, here's 6 months. So, yes. No, and nobody does. And the reason that is when the records got destroyed. So when the smaller factories were bought out by the bigger factories, they just didn't keep the records. So I tried endlessly. I spent ages at the archives field, and we've just got no definitive answer. They think it was probably between 50 and 60%. But yeah, we know it was thousands and thousands, but we can't put any on it.
I'd like to say thank you very much. It's been wonderful to hear these stories brought to life. So we have little gift.
Oh,
Say thank you for speaking to us.
Oh, well, thank you very much. No,
And,
open it.
I hope everyone will join me in thanking you.
Thank you.